In late 2025, Swift announced it would add a blockchain-based shared ledger to its infrastructure. If your mental model is Swift versus crypto, that should not make sense, because it sounds like the old system just picked up the tools of the new system. Swift is one of those names that crypto culture treats like a villain. It is the symbol of legacy finance, slow cross-border payments, and a world where money moves on weekdays, inside office hours, through layers of intermediaries. Blockchains show up and the story becomes simple. The new rails replace the old rails. End of movie. But here's the concrete fact that breaks that narrative. In September of 2025, Swift publicly announced it plans to add a blockchain-based shared ledger to its technology infrastructure. A year earlier, Swift announced live trials of digital asset and digital currency transactions would begin in 2025. And in early 2026, Swift described successful tokenized asset interoperability trials involving delivery versus payment settlement, interest payments, and redemption flows for tokenized bonds. So, if Swift is being replaced, why is it building? That is the contrast we are going to sit with. The retail narrative wants winners and losers. Institutions optimize for continuity, compliance, and coordination. And when the architecture shifts, incumbents do not just surrender. They change the layer they compete on. By the end of this video, you will have a clean mental model for what Swift is trying to become in a tokenized world, why it keeps using the phrase digital islands, and what this move changes in the real world as money and assets become tokenized. Everything here is for educational and entertainment purposes only, not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. If clear, no hype crypto education helps you make sense of all this. Hit like and subscribe. It tells YouTube this series is worth showing to other newcomers, and it helps me keep building it for you. Here's the reframe. The most important thing about Swift is not speed. It is reach and operational trust. Swift, historically, is a global messaging network used by financial institutions to coordinate cross-border activity. It is not a public blockchain. It is not a retail payment app. It is a standardized way for banks to communicate instructions, confirmations, and status across borders, at scale, inside a regulated operating model. And once you see Swift that way, the incentives sharpen. Banks do not wake up wanting a faster blockchain. Banks wake up wanting fewer failed payments, fewer reconciliation fires, fewer compliance breaks, and fewer unknowns in the middle of a transfer. The highest cost is not a few seconds of settlement time. The highest cost is uncertainty, exception handling, and operational risk. So, when tokenized assets and new rails show up, Swift is not thinking, how do we become a coin? Swift is thinking, how do we stay the default coordination layer as value becomes more programmable and more fragmented? That is the game. Coordination. Now we can talk about the phrase Swift itself has used, digital islands. This is not marketing poetry. In its own public communications, Swift has described the emerging tokenized landscape as a set of digital islands that struggle to interoperate at scale. That language matters because it tells you how the incumbent sees the threat. As tokenization accelerates, different assets end up living on different platforms. Different banks experiment on different ledgers. Different jurisdictions build different rule sets. And suddenly the financial system starts to look like a map of disconnected networks. That fragmentation sounds like innovation until you are the one responsible for making payments, settling trades, and reporting accurately under KYC and AML obligations. Because fragmentation creates a new kind of risk. If value lives on a set of disconnected platforms, then moving value between them becomes a specialized operation. The points of failure multiply. The number of interfaces multiply. And every interface is a place where controls can break. This is why the institutional question is rarely, which chain wins? The institutional question is, how do we connect systems without breaking compliance? And how do we do it without rebuilding our entire operational model for each new platform? That is why SWIFT cares about digital islands. It is not afraid of blockchains. It is afraid of a world where blockchains create 1,000 separate operating environments that do not talk to each other cleanly. If this sounds like a sudden pivot, it is not. SWIFT has been laying the groundwork in public step by step. In 2023, SWIFT communicated that it was exploring how tokenized value could move across multiple blockchain networks, because tokenization only scales if interoperability exists. In 2024, SWIFT announced that live trials of digital asset and digital currency transactions would begin in 2025, specifically framing the challenge as the rise of disconnected platforms. That is the digital islands idea, formalized. Also in 2024, SWIFT, UBS Asset Management, and Chainlink described a pilot that bridged tokenized fund workflows with existing payment systems, including the idea of settling off-chain in fiat while still coordinating the tokenized asset side of the transaction through institutional infrastructure. Then, in September of 2025, SWIFT announced a blockchain-based shared ledger would be added to its infrastructure, positioned as a way to accelerate and scale digital finance benefits. And in early 2026, SWIFT described successful trials that focused on delivery versus payment settlement, interest payouts, and redemption of tokenized bonds, with roles like custodian, registrar, and paying agent, orchestrated across both blockchain platforms and traditional systems. That is not a company ignoring crypto. That is a multi-year sequence of experiments, pilots, and public statements about one goal: a single point of access, many forms of value, one coordination layer. Now let's slow down and be precise, because this is where people start hallucinating. SWIFT announcing a shared ledger does not mean SWIFT is using a public chain. SWIFT is not announcing that it has chosen one blockchain to rule the world. It is announcing that it plans to add a blockchain-based component to its own infrastructure stack. SWIFT's stated framing is that this shared ledger can help record, sequence, and validate transactions and enforce rules through smart contracts. The purpose is not ideological decentralization. The purpose is operational coordination for instant, always-on cross-border flows at scale. And if you are a bank, that promise hits a very specific pain point. Always-on transactions are easy to say and hard to do. The hardest part is not the transfer itself. The hardest part is synchronizing all the states around it, across institutions, with rules, controls, and audit trails. So, the shared ledger move is best understood as an attempt to create a coordination substrate that can sit between tokenized environments and traditional environments, allowing them to behave like one orchestrated process. That is the strategic meaning. Not surrender, not replacement. An upgrade of the layer SWIFT wants to own. This is where the story gets real, because SWIFT did not just talk. It described real workflows. In early 2026, SWIFT emphasized delivery versus payment settlement and tokenized bond lifecycle events, like interest payments and redemption. Those are not toy examples. Those are the real mechanics of capital markets. Delivery versus payment is one of those phrases that sounds technical until you translate it. It means you do not want the asset to move unless the money moves, and you do not want the money to move unless the asset moves. It is a synchronized handoff, and synchronized handoffs are where systems fail when networks are fragmented. SWIFT described those trials as orchestrating tokenized asset transactions across both blockchain platforms and traditional systems as a single coordinated process. This is the core of the institutional thesis. The future is not one chain. The future is systems that can hand off responsibilities cleanly. And in that world, the most powerful position is not always the chain where an asset lives. The powerful position is the layer that coordinates how assets and money move together under rules. So what does this change in the real world? First, it changes the default assumption that incumbents will sit still. If tokenization creates new rails, the incumbents will compete by standardizing the interfaces and orchestrating the flows. That is what SWIFT is signaling. Second, it changes how you should interpret adoption. A world where banks use tokenized assets does not automatically mean public blockchains win. It can also mean private and permissioned environments expand, while interoperability layers decide what can talk to what. Third, it changes the competitive map for stablecoins and new payment rails. Stablecoins do not just compete on speed, they compete by routing around intermediaries. Swift's shared ledger direction is a direct response to that kind of disintermediation pressure, because it tries to preserve bank-to-bank coordination, even as new forms of value emerge. Now, what it does not change. It does not prove that Swift has endorsed any specific public token. It does not prove that Swift will replace every legacy process overnight. It does not prove that the old system is dead. It proves something more subtle. The center of gravity is moving, and Swift is moving with it. Here's a clearly labeled thought experiment, not a claim, a model. Imagine a world where money becomes tokenized, assets become tokenized, and every major institution runs pilots on multiple platforms. In that world, the problem is not building one perfect chain. The problem is coordinating flows between systems that were never designed to be natively compatible. If that is the world we are walking into, then there are two competing strategies. One strategy is rail first. Build a new value rail and try to pull everything onto it. The other strategy is coordination first. Accept that many rails will exist and become the layer that makes them interoperable, compliant, and operationally usable. Swift is signaling that it wants to be coordination first. And that is why the shared ledger idea matters. Not because it is flashy, because it is a claim about where power sits when finance becomes modular. At the beginning of this video, the paradox was simple. People talk like Swift is being replaced by blockchains. But Swift is building blockchain-based infrastructure. Now we can say it cleanly. Swift is not trying to win the retail narrative. Swift is trying to win the coordination layer of tokenized finance. It is responding to digital islands by building bridges, orchestration, and shared infrastructure that keeps institutions inside a compliant operating model while still participating in a tokenized world. And if coordination becomes modular, the next frontier is what happens when settlement itself becomes modular. That is the deeper shift to watch. Not headlines about who beat whom, but which layer becomes indispensable as money and assets move across many systems at once. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive. This channel is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and is not financial advice. Always do your own research and keep the discussion respectful. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing it with a friend.